when terrorists went into a restaurant in Bangladesh, and you know who the people were that lived? The people who could quote the Quran. People who weren't Muslim were killed. Where is God in the midst of our suffering? And maybe even today it's a matter of life and death. Could it be? As we look, I think we're going to find some answers. Because in the midst of suffering, and especially martyrdom, this question takes on a much deeper significance. A much more deeper significance than how come the Mavericks didn't get a Class A free agent. So as we look at this morning, let's see what John answers. Last week, we had this incredible view of heaven. I love the picture that we showed last week of the artist's rendition of what this throne room of God looked like, with the glory of God shining, and the judgment of God, and the grace of God. That the last image we saw last week was the Lamb that looked as if it had been slain, sitting on God's throne, and in his right hand holding a scroll that no one else could open, that no one had authority to open but him. And he held the scroll because he was able to open the scroll. And before he opens the scroll, all heaven, all creation, heaven and earth, worship God and worship the Lamb. Now, what comes next is the opening of the scrolls. There is a command that comes from heaven. And it's almost like, no, it's not almost like, it's like in Revelation 5 and 6, it tells us all about how constantly they're worshiping God. It says, the four living creatures do this, and whenever the four living creatures do this, then the 24 elders and all creation worship God. But it says that four living creatures never stop doing this, which means heaven is the worship of God 24/7. But when the Lamb takes the scroll and begins to open the seals, something changes. The whole attitude, the whole ambiance of heaven changes. The worship stops. And one of the four living creatures will speak with this loud and thundering peal of lightning and thunder voice. Events take place. Seals are opened. Imperatives are commanded, coming from the throne. And through this we discover that the authority and majesty of God and Lamb and of the Lamb exist even in the midst of suffering. And as we look at this morning, in the midst of bad things, God still reigns. As we look at this overall image, it still seems to be connected with Old Testament apocalyptic writings from Ezekiel and Zechariah. But now we're starting to see some other images thrown in. And we're starting to see images that relate to the words of Jesus himself. These words that are all quoted in all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So now, not only is John making reference to the Old Testament, but now he's starting to bring in the words of Jesus himself. Because it is, of course, the Lamb who was on the throne. So this morning we're going to unpack these seals. That we're going to look at these seals and we're going to discern what we can about God's role in suffering. And answer the question, where is he? So we're going to take a look. Let's take a look, first of all, first seal number 1, the first seal. Revelation 6:1-2 says this, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, Come. And I looked, and there before me was a white horse, and its rider held a bow and was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. So when the Lamb opens his first seal, there is a massive shift, again, in the ambience of heaven. The worship of the Lamb is paused, and there's this loud command. Now, depending on your translation, some of them will say, Come. Some will say, Behold. And there's some discussion to whether the creature is talking to the horse and the horseman or to John himself. But as we look at this, we have appearing in the throne room of God this great white horse with a rider on it. He is dressed as a warrior. He has a crown on his head, a sign of his impending victory. And this white horse, and the white horse is what a general would ride into on a conquered city. So the conquest that this horseman is going to bring apparently has taken place. But also, we see the bow in his hand. Now this brings us to an image that we get in Psalm 45, because this image in Psalm 45 is called a messianic prophecy. Within the psalm, it's talking about Jesus. Look and see what it says with me in verses 3-6. Gird your sword on your side, you mighty one. Clothe yourself with splendor and majesty. In your majesty, ride forth victoriously in the cause of truth, humility, and justice. Let your right hand achieve awesome deeds. Let your sharp arrows pierce the hearts of the king's enemies. Let the nations fall beneath your feet. Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom, referring to Jesus as the king. But there's also some question. There's also some discussion when we look at the king firing the arrows into victory, and that is this. How can the horseman be Jesus if the Lamb is on the throne? See, a lot of people will look at this and say, well, that horseman is Jesus from later on in 18, 19, and 20, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks. So how can Jesus be before Jesus, and how can the creature command the one who has authority? But there's also another question, and this is where it gets a little tricky, as if Revelation doesn't get tricky enough. Because here, there's some discussion over these 4 horsemen. Are these 4 horsemen of God, or are they of Satan? See, those who view that these horsemen are of Satan will look at it from this perspective as Job. That God gave Satan permission for a time to cause suffering in Job's life. Is this a reference here? Is this something that we see? And maybe it's just the next 3 horsemen, because this white horse, it couldn't be anything bad, right? Because it's a white horse and he's riding to victory. When we take it in context of the culture, there's a problem with that. Because a figure of a king riding a white horse with a crown and a bow in his hand is exactly how the Greek god Apollos was referred to. So some believe, and I find this interesting, that this horseman is action, and the conquest and the victory that is coming is a symbol of false prophecy that has gone throughout the earth. Because face it, doesn't false prophecy look appealing? It really does. And don't people fall for false prophecy just because it's packaged well or has a nice smile? Yeah. So maybe. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know. But what we do know is that whether it's from God or from Satan, with God allowing this to take place, there's coming a war. And there's going to come conquest. And the question is it for us or against it? How is this going to work? So as we look at this, we need to move on then to the second seal. And remember, I said each of these seals could definitely be a sermon on its own. The second seal, Revelation 6, 3 through 4. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one, and its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. So if the first horseman then is bent on conquest, the second brings with it strife. Now, while some see this as the persecution of the church, other people, and I'm going to buy in with the other people, that persecution is just a part of the overall picture. Strife. Think about strife for just a second. What is the one thing that always happens in a church when things start going well? Someone wants to cause strife. When you think about any organization you've ever been, things start going well, what's somebody do? Strife. Strife is deadly. And we see this being played out. Now, if this strife is a single part of a more complex meaning, we also then have to link it to Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 10. Because Jesus said these words, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Okay. The point of Matthew's text here is that Jesus' followers should not be discouraged from confessing his name to a world when persecution comes, since such persecution is part of God's sovereign will. Their faithfulness amid opposition may be exactly the loss of their own physical life, but it will also result in the salvation of the spiritual life. One thing I found very interesting in my study, the Greek word sword is a euphemism in Greek culture for persecution. So could it be understood when Jesus said he didn't come to bring peace but persecution? Where does our suffering come from? The third seal. Oh, before we get to the third seal, let me jump back because I did miss one thing. One of the things that people find is that this horse rider that brings strife is almost entirely seen as a demonic force. Third seal then. Revelation 6, 5, and 6. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, before me was a black horse, and its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hands. Then I heard what sounded like a voice from the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages. And do not damage the oil and the wine. The next horse brings about famine and economic collapse. What was it, last week? We heard on the news that the Great Britain decided to get out of the EU. And the next thing is people didn't know what was going to happen, and the Dow Jones over 2 days dropped 900 points, and people are starting to panic. But we're talking here about real panic. We're talking about an economic situation where people can't afford just the basics of life. The story's told after World War I in Germany, which led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, that people were taking wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread. That the inflation was so bad. Now, when the creatures start calling out that a day's wages for 2 pounds of wheat or 6 pounds of barley, what? Now, what I want you to imagine is that you work all day and your entire day wages goes for you to have enough bread to sustain yourself for one day. Now, notice I didn't say you and your family. You. Just you. 2 pounds of wheat or 6 pounds of barley is enough to sustain a person for one day. Okay, if I'm spending all my day's wages on wheat for a loaf of bread, how am I paying my electricity bill? Or my car payment? Or my mortgage? You're not. There is such a famine in the land that the people can't afford anything. What's the rider carrying? Scales. Now, when we see scales, we think of Lady Justice. And in ancient times, when there was a famine, they would weigh out equal shares of food for people, and it was usually not sustainable, enough to sustain one. And then we get to this next part that's kind of confusing when the creatures also say, don't touch the oil or the wine. Why not? Why not touch the oil and the wine? Why is it just the wheat and the barley that the famine attacks? Guess what? The oil and the wine are other parts of making the bread or eating the bread. So I want you to think about this for just a second. If it takes 2 day wages or a day's wage just to have enough wheat to have a loaf of bread, but you can't afford the oil, what are you eating? You don't need to offer the oil and the wine. There's another image. They would take the flour and they'd mix it with oil and make a bread. And then they would take wine. And they would take this unleavened bread and take it with wine. Anybody see the illustration here? It was costing them everything, but they couldn't come together around the Lord's table because they didn't have the elements. They couldn't afford the elements. The suffering is affecting the church. It's not that they're forgetting, it's that they can't. They can't survive. The fourth seal. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard a voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death and Hades, and was following close behind him. They were given the power over the fourth of the earth to kill by the sword, famine, and plague, and the wild beast of the earth. When we get to the fourth rider, we have death. Some will assimilate this to, or assume this is the Grim Reaper, but this pale horse, who some see as kind of like a pale, sickly green. This pale horse is death, and he's working together with the other three riders. And this is viewed as the climax of all persecution, which will affect the church. Now, whether this is a single horse or in combination of the three, we see this definitely as demonic in nature. Now, it says that it brings with it death and Hades. Now, when these two words are used simultaneously in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, to refer to the abode of the dead. In other words, they're filling up hell. They're filling up the place where people go. And also seems to be a reference to Hosea. But the command to kill is also an imperative, and it is seen working in conjunction with these first three horsemen. And this world point of view, death is the most extreme punishment that someone can be put through. When we think about our culture, what in a court of law, you're convicted of murder, what's the worst thing they can do to you? Give you the death penalty. This is the death penalty for a quarter of the earth. The death toll is going to be unprecedented, and it's going to be extreme. Now I want to pause quickly for a summary of these first four seals. Because what is the message? What is the message of these four horsemen? First, we have to acknowledge that Jesus is in control of all, even in control of suffering and even in control of persecution. He is sovereign over all. That he is giving Satan command for a short period of time. And the lesson we get here is two-pronged. First, for the believer, it teaches us to be faithful and endure even through the hard times. For the unbeliever, we see punishment for not believing. So as we look at this, we realize that these four horsemen are going to have an effect. Where is God in the midst of our suffering? He's sovereign. The fifth seal then. It says, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of the Lord and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? Each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. With the fifth seal, we see a radical shift taking place in the opening of the seals. We go from suffering to the reaction to the suffering. Now, their question here makes a lot of sense. And I will bet every dollar I have that everyone in this room has asked the same question. How long? How long is this going to take place? How long is this person going to suffer? How long are we going to have to deal with this? Why do more have to die? Do you ever wonder? Why, when we read this, haven't enough people suffered already? Why does there have to be more? Because there needs to be a full number. It is for the growth and strength of the church and the believers. Now let me say that again. Suffering exists for the growth and maturity of the believer. That's a hard one to take. But let me put it this way. Throughout history, the church has always grown its strongest numerically and spiritually in times of suffering. Is there a reason why we don't want to suffer? Well, yeah, it's not pleasant. But in the midst of suffering, we draw closer to Him. I know in my life when things aren't going well, who do I have to lean on but God? I'm reminded of those people who were beheaded by ISIS members, that before they were beheaded, they called out to Christ because they were believers. Let me ask this question. Is death the worst possible punishment after all? From a Christian perspective. Because the martyrs, those who have died for the faith, were given white robes. Let's go back 2 weeks and we think about the letters to the 7 churches. The white robes represent those who had overcome, those who were victorious. Maybe that's a positive. Let's look at the 6th seal. I watched as he opened the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth, and as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes and generals, the rich and the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves among the rocks and the mountains. And they called to the mountains and to the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" Now we have a second shift. We have this great cosmic scene of the destruction of all heaven and earth. The sword taken and breaking heaven and slicing heaven in half. We have everything that we've come to know disappear. The heavens turning red, the blood of heaven from Joel chapter 2. Then there's this discussion. Okay, there's a lot of discussion as you study this. Is this literal or is this figuratively? Is this really going to happen or is this an analogy of what's going to take place? Whatever the case, it seems like there's going to be some cataclysmic event, and there seems to be a marker of something pretty drastic that's going to take place, that is taking place or is about to take place. World leaders who have not followed God and have persecuted the believers are now hiding in caves and calling the mountains to crush them. This is again a reference to the Old Testament literature, Jeremiah, Hosea, Isaiah, the theme and description that Jesus also references in Matthew. But now we have one final reference, one final thought. When we look at Old Testament literature, we see the sun and the moon and the stars. All images, all things that people would worship instead of God. Correct? They'd worship the stars, the moon, the sun. Could this be God eliminating all the competition? God saying, you want to worship this? Fine, it's gone. You want to worship the moon? I'm going to turn it to blood. You want to worship the stars? They're gone. They've fallen like figs from a tree. The only God to worship is the God of heaven and the Lamb who sits on his throne. And you either accept that or you reject that. There's no other option you have left. Because this 6th seal has been opened. And we're changing the equation. No longer do you have a choice between Confucius and Islam and whatever. You choose God or you choose death. Well, that seems pretty harsh, preacher, doesn't it? So, 7th seal. The 7th seal. Well, before we do that, there's this great intermission. Because in the midst of this, when God sets everything in place, do you realize what happens? When God strikes down the sun and the moon and the stars and heaven and earth, he changes everything. What's all creation do? All of a sudden we worship again. Did you catch that? All of a sudden, they're worshiping the Lamb. It's like they could only hold it in so long until they had to break out and worship. I love that part. Let's jump to the 7th seal. The 7th seal, Revelation 8. When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people and the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke from the incense, I'm going to stop there. You know why? Because there was silence in heaven for half an hour, because this 7th seal is going to bring in the trumpets and the censers and the bowls. And the best way I know to build a sense of anticipation is this. Let's pray.